Black woman told to move from first-class lounge. Her response shocks the entire airport. Ava Johnson, a prominent civil rights leader, felt the weight of judgment as she entered the exclusive space. Her presence immediately questioned by those who believed she didn't belong. In a world where privilege often silences the marginalized, how would Ava confront the biases laid bare before her, and what powerful truths would emerge from this unexpected confrontation? Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Ava Johnson adjusted the strap of her leather satchel as she stepped into the opulent VIP lounge. The quiet hum of conversation mingled with the soft clinking of glasses, creating a cocoon of exclusivity. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, mingling with a faint trace of expensive cologne. Ava's heels clicked softly against the polished marble floor as she made her way to the reception desk, her tailored navy suit impeccably pressed, and her natural curls framing her face like a crown. The lounge was a picture of understated luxury. Velvet armchairs in muted tones of cream and charcoal were scattered across the space, inviting travelers to sink into their embrace. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in soft, natural light, offering a panoramic view of the tarmac where planes glided to a halt with measured grace. In one corner, a sleek espresso machine stood beside a counter laden with delicate pastries and bowls of vibrant fruit. This was a place reserved for those who had, in some way or another, arrived. Ava smiled politely at the receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly coiffed bun and a crisp, white blouse. "Good morning," Ava began, her voice calm yet firm. "Ava Johnson. I have access through the summit sponsorship." The receptionist's gaze flicked briefly over Ava's face before she nodded. "Of course, Ms. Johnson. Welcome." Her tone was professional, but Ava caught the faintest hesitation, a pause so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by someone less attuned to it. Ava collected her welcome packet, which included a drink voucher and a glossy pamphlet detailing the lounge's amenities, and walked into the main seating area. The weight of her role, the president of an international civil rights organization, settled on her shoulders like a familiar, well-worn coat. She had just completed the first leg of her journey to the Global Equality Summit, a gathering of leaders, activists, and policymakers committed to advancing social justice worldwide. This wasn't just a conference for Ava, it was her life's work. As she made her way to an empty armchair near the window, Ava felt the weight of unspoken gazes following her. A group of businessmen, dressed in sharp suits and seated in a semicircle nearby, glanced in her direction. Their murmured conversation faltered for a moment before resuming, and Ava caught a faint smirk on one of their faces. She lowered herself into the chair with practiced composure, setting her satchel on the small table beside her. Her fingers brushed against the edges of the folder containing her summit presentation, the one she had spent weeks refining. The theme of the summit this year was Bridging Divides, Building a Future of Equality. Ava's presentation, an exploration of systemic inequality and strategies for fostering inclusion, was one she had given variations of countless times. Yet, each delivery felt as urgent and necessary as the first. As she waited for her coffee, Ava allowed herself a moment to take in the room. Travelers of all kinds filled the lounge, solo flyers absorbed in their laptops, couples murmuring softly to each other, and professionals scrolling through their phones with an air of detachment. Yet, despite the diversity in attire and demeanor, one thing was clear. This was a space curated for those accustomed to privilege. Her coffee arrived in a sleek porcelain cup, its rich aroma a small comfort amidst the unease that was beginning to creep in. Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced back toward the group of businessmen and noticed one of them, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, whispering something to the man beside him. They both chuckled, their eyes briefly meeting hers before darting away. Ava's stomach tightened. It was a sensation she knew all too well, the silent scrutiny that came not from curiosity, but from skepticism. In her decades of navigating predominantly white and male-dominated spaces, she had developed a keen radar for these moments. The laugh was not harmless, it was dismissive. The glance was not casual, it was evaluative. Her mind flickered to the long road that had brought her here. Born in the Deep South during the height of the civil rights movement, Ava had grown up with stories of struggle and resilience etched into her family's history. Her father, a pastor, had marched alongside Dr. King, while her mother had worked tirelessly as a community organizer, fighting for fair housing laws. Ava had inherited their fire and their faith, though life had taught her to temper it with patience and strategy. She sipped her coffee, the bitter warmth grounding her as she let her thoughts wander to the summit. This was a crucial moment, not just for her organization, but for the movement as a whole. The stakes were higher than ever. Rising inequality, racial tensions, and political polarization had created a climate ripe for change, but only if people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Across the room, the businessmen's laughter bubbled up again, louder this time. Ava's jaw tightened, but she willed herself to remain poised. Reacting now, in this setting, would only validate whatever assumptions they had made about her. Instead, she turned her attention to her notes, flipping through the neatly printed slides that outlined her vision for a more equitable future. But the words blurred on the page as memories surfaced unbidden. The college professor who had questioned her thesis topic on racial inequality, asking if it was too narrow. The manager at her first job who had mistaken her for an intern and sent her on coffee runs during meetings where she was supposed to be presenting. The countless moments of being othered in spaces where she was one of the few or the only person of color. Ava straightened her back, forcing the memories to recede. She wasn't here to dwell on the past. She was here to shape the future. Still, the businessmen's laughter and sidelong glances lingered in her periphery, a reminder that even in spaces designed for comfort and privilege, she was often met with resistance. As the announcement for her flight echoed softly through the lounge, Ava gathered her belongings and rose from her chair. She took a final glance around the room, her eyes lingering on the businessmen for a moment longer than necessary. They didn't notice. They rarely did. Walking toward the exit, Ava's steps were steady, her resolve unshaken. The world was watching, yes, but not just her. Everything she represented. Every glance, every whisper, every chuckle. They weren't just about her. They were about the countless others who had been told, in ways both subtle and overt, that they didn't belong. And that was precisely why she did. As Ava waited at the boarding gate for her flight, the weight of the lounge encounter lingered in her mind. She tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the summit ahead, but the memory clung stubbornly. The businessmen's whispered remarks and dismissive glances had stirred something deep within her, a mixture of anger, frustration, and something she rarely allowed herself to feel: exhaustion. The flight attendant called for first-class boarding, and Ava stepped forward. Her seat, nestled at the front of the plane, offered a brief reprieve from the constant need to assert her place. She settled into the plush seat, placing her satchel under the chair in front of her. A few minutes later, to her mild annoyance, the same group of businessmen entered, filling the row across the aisle. One of them, the tall man with salt and pepper hair, glanced her way, his expression unreadable. She averted her eyes and reached for her folder, determined to review her notes. As the plane ascended, Ava's thoughts drifted back to the lounge. Did I misinterpret their glances? She wondered briefly, but the question was quickly dismissed. She had long learned to trust her instincts about these moments. Their behavior was not new. It was a familiar script she had encountered countless times. The memory triggered others, each a sharp shard of the same glass. There was the board meeting where a senior executive had suggested that her input on diversity issues was too emotional. The networking dinner where a colleague had commented on her surprising eloquence, as if her ability to articulate her ideas was unexpected. And the time a security guard had questioned her presence at a gala, despite her name being on the invitation as a keynote speaker. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a constant undercurrent of doubt that she had been navigating her entire life. The plane touched down smoothly in Geneva, the city's snow-capped mountains visible in the distance as Ava disembarked. The summit's opening session was set to begin the following evening, leaving her a few hours to settle into her hotel and prepare. Her mind raced with thoughts about her presentation, the connections she hoped to forge, and the possibility of bringing real change to the discussions that awaited her. But the memory of the lounge lingered. That evening, Ava found herself replaying the scene as she unpacked. The whispered doubts from the businessmen had felt more cutting than usual, perhaps because they were layered over her own growing fatigue. How many times will I have to prove that I belong? She wondered, her reflection staring back at her in the hotel mirror. Her mind wandered to a time when she was just starting out. She was fresh out of college, her diploma still crisp, and she had secured a coveted internship at a prestigious nonprofit. On her first day, she had walked into the office eager to contribute, only to be greeted with puzzled stares. An older colleague had even asked, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" It wasn't meant maliciously, but the implication was clear. She didn't fit their image of who belonged in those halls. Decades later, the sting of those moments had dulled, but the memories remained. They had shaped her, not into the angry stereotype she feared others expected, but into a woman of quiet, relentless determination. Ava had turned every whispered doubt into a stepping stone, climbing higher and higher, until she stood at the helm of one of the world's most respected civil rights organizations. The next morning, Ava rose early, the crisp Swiss air invigorating as she made her way to the summit venue. The grandeur of the conference center mirrored the importance of the event. Sleek glass walls reflecting the surrounding Alps, banners fluttering with the summit's logo, and attendees bustling with purpose. Inside, Ava felt the familiar duality of belonging and otherness. She knew she deserved to be here. She had worked tirelessly to earn her place. Yet, as she looked around at the predominantly white and male crowd, she couldn't ignore the subtle awareness that her presence was still an anomaly. The opening keynote was delivered by a renowned economist, his words powerful and persuasive. But as Ava listened, she couldn't help but notice the lack of intersectionality in his analysis. It was a conversation she had engaged in countless times, well-meaning experts who addressed inequality in broad strokes, leaving out the nuances of race, gender, and lived experience. During the networking break, Ava found herself standing alone near the coffee table, observing the room. The businessmen from the lounge were there, mingling with other attendees, their laughter ringing out as they exchanged business cards. Ava debated whether to approach them, to challenge their assumptions with a conversation that could open their minds. But before she could decide, she overheard snippets of their conversation. "She's probably just a figurehead. You know how these organizations like to pick someone who ticks all the boxes," one of them said, his voice low, but not low enough. Another chuckled. "Yeah, but does she even know what she's talking about? Or is she just here for the photo op?" Ava felt her breath catch, the words cutting through her like ice. She gripped her coffee cup tightly, the ceramic warm against her fingers. The room seemed to tilt for a moment, the buzz of conversation fading into the background as their words echoed in her mind. Figurehead, ticks all the boxes. Photo op. She set the cup down carefully, her hands trembling. Ava took a deep breath, willing herself to stay composed. This wasn't the first time she had been reduced to a stereotype, and it wouldn't be the last. But the sting of it never lessened. No matter how many accolades she earned, no matter how many lives her work touched, there would always be those who questioned her competence, her authenticity, her right to be in the room. Later that evening, as Ava prepared for her own panel discussion, she sat alone in the green room, her notebook open on her lap. The panel was focused on dismantling systemic inequalities, a topic Ava had lived and breathed for years. But tonight, the weight of the businessmen's words sat heavily on her chest. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply as she recited the mantra that had carried her through so many moments like this. You are enough. You have always been enough. Their doubts are not your truth. A knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. A young assistant poked her head in, her expression apologetic. "Ms. Johnson, you're on in 5. Ava nodded, rising to her feet. As she walked to the stage, she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. The whispers of doubt might follow her, but they would never define her. The stage lights cast a warm glow as Ava concluded her panel discussion. Her words had resonated, evidenced by the audible hum of agreement and the steady applause that followed. As she left the stage, several attendees approached her, thanking her for her insights and sharing how her ideas had sparked new perspectives. For a moment, the lingering unease from the businessmen's whispers receded, replaced by a sense of validation and purpose. Yet, the reprieve was fleeting. The summit schedule was packed, and Ava was determined to make the most of her time networking and building alliances. During the mid-afternoon break, she made her way to one of the venue's exclusive lounges, seeking a quiet corner to recharge and prepare for her next meeting. The lounge was a space designed for comfort and convenience, with sleek furniture and a serene ambience. Ava approached the reception desk, her summit credentials prominently displayed around her neck. She smiled at the two women staffing the desk, Emily and Sarah, both dressed in crisp uniforms. "Good afternoon," Ava said. "I'd like to access the lounge, please." Emily, the taller of the two, glanced briefly at Ava's badge, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. She exchanged a glance with Sarah before replying, her tone polite but edged with something Ava couldn't quite place. "Do you have a confirmation of your eligibility for this lounge?" Emily asked, her eyes lingering on Ava's face a moment too long. Ava felt the now familiar pang of irritation. "Yes," she replied evenly, gesturing to her badge. "This provides access to all summit lounges." Emily hesitated, her eyes scanning the badge as if searching for a flaw. Sarah, meanwhile, busied herself with the computer, her fingers tapping rapidly on the keyboard. "We just need to verify your access level," Sarah added, her tone overly saccharine. "It's standard procedure." Ava glanced over her shoulder. Behind her, two men in suits approached the desk. Emily and Sarah greeted them with broad smiles, waving them through without so much as a glance at their credentials. Ava turned back to the women, her patience fraying. "Is there an issue?" Ava asked, her voice calm but firm. Emily's cheeks flushed slightly. "Oh, no issue," she said quickly. "It's just sometimes there are mix-ups with access badges. We want to make sure everything is in order." Everything in Ava's body screamed for her to challenge them outright, but years of experience had taught her the art of composure. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the official letter of confirmation, sliding it across the desk. "Here," Ava said. "This should clear up any confusion." The two women examined the letter, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something that looked uncomfortably close to embarrassment. Emily handed the letter back with a strained smile. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson. You're all set." Ava nodded, tucking the letter back into her bag. Without another word, she entered the lounge, her chest tight with a mix of anger and disappointment. Inside, Ava found a seat near the window, her gaze fixed on the cityscape beyond. The interaction replayed in her mind, each moment sharpening the edges of her frustration. She had done nothing wrong, yet she had been singled out, made to feel as though she needed to prove her legitimacy in a space where others were simply assumed to belong. Her thoughts drifted to a conversation she'd had years ago with her mentor, Dr. Miriam Ellis, a trailblazer in civil rights advocacy. Miriam had warned her about moments like these, the quiet but relentless tests of her worthiness. "They'll make you feel like you're an intruder," Miriam had said. "Like you have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as competent. Don't let them diminish you. You belong in every room you enter." Ava had taken those words to heart, carrying them like armor. But today, the weight of that armor felt heavier than usual. Her reverie was interrupted by a voice. "Ms. Johnson?" Ava looked up to see a young woman standing hesitantly nearby, a notebook clutched to her chest. She was one of the summit's volunteers, her nervous energy evident in the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Yes," Ava replied, softening her tone. "I just wanted to say, your panel earlier was incredible," the woman said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I've never heard anyone articulate those issues so clearly. It really inspired me." Ava smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot to me." The woman lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, she added, "I hope you know how important your work is. People like you give people like me hope." Ava's smile widened, the young woman's words a balm to her frayed nerves. "That's very kind of you to say," she replied. "Thank you for sharing that with me." As the woman walked away, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose. The moments of doubt and scrutiny were painful, yes, but they were not the whole story. For every person who questioned her presence, there were others who saw her for who she truly was, a leader, an advocate, and a source of inspiration. Later that evening, as Ava prepared for a networking dinner, she found herself reflecting on the day's events. The scrutiny she had faced in the lounge wasn't new, but it was a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Biases, whether conscious or unconscious, continued to shape the way people were perceived and treated, reinforcing the very systems of inequality she had dedicated her life to dismantling. But Ava also knew that change was possible. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was worth fighting for. And as she adjusted her suit jacket and gathered her notes, she resolved to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The doubts, the scrutiny, the whispers, they were all fuel for the fire that burned within her. And as long as that fire burned, she would continue to shine a light on the path toward justice and equality. The grand hall, where the networking dinner was held, shimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung low, casting a warm glow on the meticulously arranged tables adorned with fine china and fresh floral centerpieces. Attendees buzzed with conversation, their laughter weaving through the clinking of glasses. Ava entered the room with her head held high, the confidence she had cultivated over decades a shield against the lingering unease from earlier encounters. As she navigated the room, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, Ava caught sight of a familiar group, the businessmen from the lounge. They stood clustered near the bar, their body language exuding a casual arrogance that stirred a fresh wave of irritation in her chest. She debated whether to approach them. Part of her wanted to avoid another interaction entirely, but another stronger part, the one that had driven her to dedicate her life to civil rights, urged her forward. Ava reminded herself why she was here. This summit was a platform for change, and every interaction, even the uncomfortable ones, held the potential to spark a meaningful conversation. With that resolve, she crossed the room and approached the group. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone neutral but firm. The group turned to face her, their laughter fading as they registered her presence. One of them, the man with salt and pepper hair, offered a tight smile. Ms. Johnson, isn't it?" he said, extending a hand. "We caught part of your panel earlier. Quite thought-provoking." Ava shook his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you. I'm glad you found it engaging. The issues we discussed are deeply important, and I hope they resonated." The man, Mark, according to the badge clipped to his lapel, hesitated, his smile faltering slightly. "Yes, well, it's always good to hear different perspectives." Ava didn't miss the subtle inflection on different, but she chose not to let it derail her. Perspectives are valuable, especially when they challenge us to think critically about the systems we operate within, she replied smoothly. "That's the only way progress happens." The other men shifted uncomfortably, their posture stiffening. Mark cleared his throat, clearly eager to change the subject. "So, Ms. Johnson, how did you get involved in, this line of work?" It was a question Ava had heard countless times, often delivered with the same underlying curiosity mixed with skepticism. She smiled politely. "I've been passionate about social justice for as long as I can remember. My parents were deeply involved in the civil rights movement, and their work inspired me to continue the fight for equality in all its forms." "That's admirable," another man interjected, though his tone bordered on patronizing. "But I imagine it must be challenging to balance ambition with objectivity in such emotionally charged issues." Ava's smile didn't waver, though her patience was beginning to wear thin. "It is challenging," she acknowledged, her voice steady. "But progress requires both ambition and objectivity, along with a clear understanding of the systemic barriers that perpetuate inequality. That's why discussions like the ones we're having at this summit are so vital." Before the conversation could veer further into veiled condescension, a staff member approached the group, gesturing for Ava. "Ms. Johnson, the keynote session is about to begin. They're requesting your presence on stage for the Q&A segment." Ava seized the opportunity. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I look forward to continuing this conversation another time." As she walked away, she felt their eyes on her back, but instead of feeling diminished, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had held her ground, maintaining both her dignity and her composure, a small but meaningful victory. The keynote session was a lively discussion featuring leaders from various fields, each sharing their vision for addressing inequality in their respective domains. When it came time for the Q&A, Ava fielded questions with the ease of someone deeply immersed in their work. Her answers were thoughtful and incisive, drawing nods of agreement from the audience. Toward the end of the session, a question came from a woman seated near the front. Ms. Johnson, as someone who has broken barriers in your field, how do you handle the constant scrutiny and doubt that often comes with being a trailblazer? The room fell silent, all eyes on Ava. She took a moment before answering, her gaze steady. It's not easy, she began. There are moments when the scrutiny feels overwhelming, when the doubts, both from others and sometimes even from within, threaten to overshadow the work. But I've learned that the key is to stay focused on the bigger picture. I remind myself why I do what I do and who I do it for. She paused, her voice growing firmer. Every time I face doubt or resistance, I see it as a reflection of the very systems we're working to dismantle. The scrutiny isn't just about me. It's about challenging the idea that people like me don't belong in certain spaces. And that's why it's so important that we keep showing up, keep pushing forward, and keep proving them wrong. Not for the sake of validation, but for the sake of the change we're trying to create. The audience erupted into applause, the sound filling the room like a wave. Ava smiled, not out of pride, but out of gratitude for the opportunity to speak, to be heard, and to make an impact. After the session, Ava returned to the lounge to gather her thoughts. As she sat down, she noticed Emily and Sarah, the staff members who had scrutinized her credentials earlier, approaching cautiously. Ms. Johnson, Emily began, her voice tinged with nervousness. We just wanted to apologize for earlier. We realize now that we treated you differently than other guests, and that wasn't right. Sarah chimed in, her cheeks flushed. We've been talking about it, and we realize we need to address our own biases. If you have any resources or suggestions, we'd really appreciate your guidance. Ava studied them for a moment, her expression softening. Their apology felt genuine, and the fact that they were willing to confront their biases was a step in the right direction. I appreciate your honesty, Ava said. Acknowledging bias is the first step toward change. I'd be happy to share some resources with you. Emily and Sarah nodded, their gratitude evident. As they walked away, Ava felt a small spark of hope. It was a reminder that even the smallest interactions could become opportunities for growth and understanding. That evening, as Ava prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's events. The scrutiny she had faced, the conversations she had navigated, and the apologies she had received, they were all part of the same complex tapestry of progress. Change wasn't linear, and it wasn't easy, but it was happening one interaction at a time. And as Ava drifted off to sleep, she felt a quiet sense of resolve. The fight was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. The final day of the summit dawned crisp and clear, the alpine air sharp with the promise of change. Ava stood before a tall mirror in her hotel suite, adjusting her blazer. Her reflection stared back, calm and composed, but she could feel the weight of the summit's moments, both challenging and affirming, settling on her shoulders like a cloak. Today would be pivotal. The morning plenary, focused on strategies for dismantling systemic inequality, was the highlight of the event, and Ava's voice would be one of the last the audience would hear. Before heading to the venue, Ava glanced at her revised speech. Inspired by the interactions over the past 2 days, she had made adjustments late into the night. The speech was still focused on solutions, but now it carried an added emphasis on personal accountability and the quiet, everyday biases that perpetuate inequality. This is the hard work, Ava had scrawled in the margins of her notes. Change begins in the heart and mind. As attendees settled into their seats for the plenary, Ava scanned the audience. The businessmen from the lounge were there, their expressions neutral but attentive. Emily and Sarah, the lounge staff, had also secured seats in the back, their faces earnest with anticipation. Ava felt a flicker of gratitude that they had made the effort to attend. It reminded her why she did what she did. For moments like this, when people were open to learning, to growth, to change. Ava took the stage, her steps deliberate, her presence commanding. The room quieted, and for a moment, she let the silence stretch, allowing her audience to feel the weight of the moment. When we talk about systemic inequality, she began, her voice steady and resonant, we often focus on the big picture, laws, policies, institutions. And, rightly so, these are the structures that shape our societies, the levers we must pull to create lasting change. She paused, scanning the crowd. But today, I want to talk about something smaller, something quieter. The biases that live within each of us. The assumptions we make without realizing. The actions we take without questioning. A murmur rippled through the room, a soft rustling of discomfort and recognition. Ava pressed on. These biases are like cracks in a foundation. Left unchecked, they weaken the very structures we are trying to build. And it is our responsibility, each and every one of us, to confront them, to repair them, to ensure that the weight of progress doesn't collapse under their strain. She shared a story, one they had not heard before. A story about a young girl, fresh out of college, stepping into a world that questioned her worth at every turn. That girl, Ava said, her voice softening, was me. And while I've grown stronger, while I've risen to positions of leadership, those questions have never truly disappeared. They simply evolved, becoming more insidious, more polite. The room was utterly still, the audience hanging on her every word. Ava could see the recognition in their eyes, the subtle shifts in posture as her message resonated. She knew she was not just speaking for herself, but for countless others who had faced the same invisible barriers. When the session concluded, the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't the polite clapping of people acknowledging a good speech. It was fervent, heartfelt, sustained. Ava felt a swell of emotion as she stepped down from the stage, her heart full not of pride, but of purpose. This was why she fought. This was why she endured. As she made her way through the crowd, attendees stopped her to share their reflections. One woman, an executive from a tech company, confessed that she had never truly examined her hiring practices for bias. "Your words opened my eyes," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "I want to do better. I will do better." Ava nodded, offering a warm smile. "That's where change begins," she said, with the willingness to look inward. Nearby, Emily and Sarah waited hesitantly, their earlier confidence replaced by a tentative hope. When Ava approached, they each extended a hand, their gratitude evident. "Thank you for what you said today," Emily began. "We've been talking about ways we can take what we've learned and bring it back to our team. Implicit bias training, more diverse hiring practices." Sarah chimed in. "It's not much, but it's a start, and we'd love your guidance as we move forward." Ava clasped their hands briefly, her smile one of genuine encouragement. "Starting is the hardest part," she said. "The rest is perseverance." Later that evening, Ava found herself in the lounge once more, waiting for her flight home. The space was quieter than before, the rush of summit attendees having ebbed. She sipped her tea, reflecting on the day's events, when she noticed Mark, the businessman from the lounge, approaching. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his tone cautious but earnest. "Do you have a moment?" Ava set her cup down, gesturing for him to sit. He hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair across from her. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his words tumbling out quickly, "for the way we acted in the lounge, for the things we said. It was wrong, and frankly, it was ignorant." Ava studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "What changed?" she asked gently. Mark exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Your speech. It made me realize how often I've dismissed people, consciously or unconsciously, based on assumptions I've never even questioned. I can't undo what's been done, but I want to be better, to do better." Ava's gaze softened. "Acknowledgement is the first step," she said, "but the real work comes next. It's not enough to recognize bias. You have to actively dismantle it, in yourself and in the spaces you influence." Mark nodded, his expression one of quiet determination. "I'll do the work," he said simply. As he stood to leave, Ava felt a flicker of hope. Change, she knew, was rarely dramatic. It was incremental, a series of small but meaningful steps. And tonight, one of those steps had been taken. As Ava boarded her flight, she reflected on the summit, her mind swirling with the stories shared, the connections made, and the seeds of change sown. She knew the road ahead would be long, the work arduous. But as she settled in her seat, she felt a quiet certainty. The whispered doubts, the unwarranted scrutiny, the moments of dismissal, they were all fuel. Fuel for the fire that burned within her, the fire that lit the way forward. And as the plane soared into the night sky, Ava smiled. The fight was far from over, but the future felt just a little brighter. The plane touched down in Washington, D.C., just as the first blush of dawn crept over the horizon. Ava watched the city come to life through the small, oval window. Her city, a place that had seen its share of protests, triumphs, and defeats. It was a fitting home for someone like her, whose life was a testament to resilience and purpose. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, her mind replayed the moments from the summit. The applause, the candid conversations, and the quiet but transformative encounters. Each interaction felt like a thread in a larger tapestry, one she was helping to weave into something stronger, more inclusive, and more just. A week later, Ava sat in her office, her desk cluttered with notes and proposals. Outside her window, the autumn leaves swirled in the breeze, a kaleidoscope of reds and golds. It was a rare moment of stillness, and Ava took a sip of her tea, savoring the quiet before the day's meetings began. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention back. It was an email from Emily and Sarah, the lounge staff she had met at the summit. The subject line read, "Thank you, and next steps." Ava opened it, her curiosity piqued. The email began with a heartfelt expression of gratitude for her patience and wisdom. But what struck her most was what came next, a detailed plan for implementing implicit bias training for their team, revising their hiring policies to include more diverse candidates, and creating a feedback system for travelers who experience discrimination. At the bottom of the email was a simple question. Would you be willing to review this plan and guide us further? Ava leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a smile. She tapped a reply, her words measured and encouraging. I'd be honored to help. Let's schedule a meeting to discuss your ideas. Progress starts with conversations like these. The following weeks unfolded with a flurry of activity. Ava revised her summit speech into an article, which quickly went viral. Titled "Bridging the Divide," confronting everyday bias, it struck a chord with readers, sparking discussions across social media and beyond. Emails poured into her inbox, some from strangers sharing their own experiences with bias, others from leaders seeking her advice on fostering inclusivity in their organizations. One email stood out. It was from Mark, the businessman who had approached her in the lounge. He shared that his company had just approved a new diversity initiative, inspired in part by their conversation. He ended with a line that lingered with Ava long after she closed the email. "You made me realize change isn't just necessary, it's personal." As the months passed, Ava saw ripples of change from the summit spreading outward. Emily and Sarah kept her updated on their progress, sending photos of their team during training sessions and sharing stories of travelers who felt seen and valued because of their efforts. Mark invited her to speak at his company's annual retreat, where she facilitated a workshop on implicit bias and leadership. And at her own organization, Ava used the lessons from the summit to refine their strategies, ensuring that their work remained both impactful and intersectional. But for all the progress, Ava knew the fight was far from over. There were still systems to dismantle, conversations to have, and minds to change. The work was relentless, often exhausting, but Ava carried it with the same quiet resolve that had brought her this far. One crisp evening, months after the summit, Ava stood at the podium in a packed auditorium, delivering the keynote address for a new coalition of activists and leaders. Her speech wove together stories of her journey, the challenges she had faced, and the victories she had witnessed. But it was the ending that drew a standing ovation. "We are not just fighting for justice," Ava said, her voice strong and steady. "We are building a future where every child, no matter their race, gender, or background, can walk into any room and know they belong. That future starts with us. Not tomorrow, not next year, but now. And I promise you this, together, we will create it. The applause was thunderous, the sound reverberating through the room like a promise fulfilled. Ava stepped back, her heart swelling with hope. As the crowd rose to its feet, Ava scanned the faces before her, diverse, passionate, and determined. She saw Emily and Sarah, beaming from the front row. She saw Mark, nodding with quiet pride. And she saw countless others, each carrying the fire of change in their own way. This was the power of dialogue, of connection, of confronting biases and bridging divides. This was the future Ava had been fighting for her entire life. And as she left the stage, her steps sure and steady, she knew the fight was far from over, but neither was the hope. The fire burned bright, and it would never go out.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.